candidates for office or elected officials show up, that we recognize them. We recognize the people who make a choice to be in the room with us for our community conversations. And so I just want to take a moment and acknowledge Richmond School Board member Scott Barlow. Scott, if you would stand. Thank you for being here. And also another school board candidate, Denisha Potts. Thank you for being here, Denisha. Is there another candidate? Oh, pardon me, Dawn Page, thank you so much for being here. Richmond School Board member Dawn Page, thank you for being here.
I'm running for Soil and Water Conservation Board.
Sure, would you share your name?
Marnie Palacio.
Marnie Palacio, thank you for being here. Oh, Councilwoman Robertson, thank you so much for being here. I apologize, I didn't get all the notes. Is there any other elected officials or candidates who are... No, because when people who are either running to represent us or are representing us and they make a choice to be in the room, we want to make sure we know. So, is there anyone else I missed? And I apologize for those who I didn't. Okay. Cool. Before we jump into questions, I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists. I'm going to start at the far end of the table. Please join me in welcoming Emma Clark. Emma Clark is a public school teacher at Falling Creek Middle School in Chesterfield County and a public education advocate. And next to her, please join me in welcoming Donald Wilms. Donald is a former teacher and the former president of the Chesterfield Education Association. Going in one order. And next is, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Levy. Dr. Levy is a teacher, writer, academic, and public school activist and parent. Her areas of expertise include education policy, politics of education, school governance, and school finance. And next, please join me in welcoming Chris Duncombe. Chris is the Senior Policy Analyst for Public Education and Workforce Training with the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. Okay, so we have a really excellent panel here tonight. And I want to start on the far end with Emma and ask you to, if you could lay out for us, sorry, forgive me one second. So for this first round of questions, I'm going to ask our panelists to keep your answer to about 5 minutes. And Carrie, right here, is going to help give you, Carrie, when are you going to signal them? When you have 30 seconds left, and then when you have 0 left, I will interrupt you if I have to. It's nothing personal. We're just going to try to have a great conversation. Okay, in about 5 minutes, Emma, can you give us a sense, like specifically, what's going on in Chesterfield right now?
So I first, as an aside, I want to acknowledge that Gary was actually in this documentary. So those of you who don't know enough about our moderator's background, he's also a public education advocate and has been for some time, and he helped fight to keep schools open in Philadelphia. So what we saw in the video was a focus on some aspects of privatization. We learned a lot about charters, we learned a lot about vouchers. So we learned about privatization that seeks to divert public school dollars to private institutions. But what we're seeing here in Chesterfield is a different offshoot of the privatization movement. So the privatization that we're seeing begun here in Chesterfield is through CTE, which is Career and Technical Education. And what is happening is companies are seeing public schools as an opportunity to have job training grounds for their particular company and to use our public schools to funnel children that are optimized for the type of work that they would like people to do. So very recently, the Chamber of Commerce, which is not a government organization. It is an organization that considers itself to be the voice of businesses. They put together an event where they brought all 5 of our current Chesterfield school board members, the superintendent of Richmond Public Schools, several principals from Chesterfield, and other representatives from districts in the area. And they brought them to tour the Ford too many acronyms, Ford NGL Academies in Nashville, Tennessee. So the Ford NGL program is an offshoot of Ford, the motor company, and it is their education arm. And you may wonder, what does this motor company want with education? And it's exactly what I described. They would like to see our public schools turn out employees for their company. So a lot of the attendees of this event were very impressed with what they saw. As you can see from the documentary, there's a lot of money that goes into marketing for these types of programs. So when they came back, they wanted to do a program here in Chesterfield and also in Richmond Public Schools. What happened very soon after this event was a $50,000 grant was received by Chesterfield from Ford NGL to create these academies, which look currently like what are called innovation academies in our 4 of our high schools in Chesterfield. So we do have a FOIA document that shows that this money was received. They have since claimed that that money was returned. However, if you compare the curriculum of what we are doing in Chesterfield right now to the Ford NGL program, it is nearly identical. And we do not have any proof that that money was in fact returned. And we are listed on the Ford website along with Richmond as a Phase 1 Ford NGL community. So I think it's really important something that was said in the film was they said this happens, we're losing our public education city after city. And it is being done on the local level. It's not being done at the national level because they can't do it at the national level. They don't have the facts on their side. They can't win that debate. So when they do it at the local level, they do what Chesterfield is doing now. They hide it by renaming things. They hide it by not keeping documents transparent and open to the public. They keep us from knowing what's going on, and they sell it to us. So the Chamber of Commerce, this voice for businesses in the area, has hired West Carey Group, which is a PR company that is going to be, over the next year, trying to lay the groundwork for public support for this programming. So that is where we are currently at in Chesterfield. And I think Don is next.
Cool, yeah.
Thank you, Emma. So, Don, I want to follow up on what Emma started to raise, where she talked about how corporate interests move this when the facts aren't on their side. And one of the things that we know is that they develop certain narratives. I was trained in something called narrative power analysis, right? And you ask the question, when you think of the narrative that's being told, how is the conflict being framed? What are the conditions responsible for this conflict? Who are the key characters? All these questions, when the facts are on their side, sometimes stories are told to push an agenda. And so I wanted to ask, what are the narratives that are being pushed by the corporate interests and by the elected officials who support them to try to move privatization in our area?
Well, the harshest of these narratives is that our public schools are failing, and this narrative was hatched during the Reagan administration, and it led to Virginia's SOL testing, which eventually led to No Child Left Behind and a national testing program and testing standards. Another narrative says that our graduates are not prepared for the workforce. Another says that public schools have no competition and therefore no incentive to get better. This narrative led to the narrative Vouchers for private schools and charter schools were the way to make public schools competitive, and tuition tax credits for the big corporation that supported those vouchers and charters. And still another says that big business knows how to do competition, so why don't we run our schools the way businesses are run? Or better yet, why don't we just allow businesses to tell us how to run our schools? Or even better than that, let's have businesses run programs in our schools, which is what Ford and GL wants to do. Now these narratives are bad. First of all, the narrative that our schools lack accountability is what led to the testing culture, a culture of carrots and sticks to raise test scores with tests that are biased toward the reality of white middle-class students and ignore the American experiences of minorities and people who are economically less advantaged. Charter schools on average have performed slightly lower than public schools on average, and they've contributed in some cases to the resegregation of our schools, all while taking money from our public schools. And when there's less money coming to the public schools, what can the public schools do? Can they chop off one wing and say, get rid of that, we're not going to pay it for anymore? Can they call Dominion Resources and say, we're only going to pay the bill for this many students and you're going to have to give them the rest for free? No, the only thing public schools can do is cut programs. So goodbye music, goodbye art, that's how it works. Additionally, this systematic demoralization of public education has given us the situation where hardly anybody wants to become a teacher anymore, and we have tremendous teacher shortages. And those of you in this audience who have children in public schools, I can assure you that right now your children either have had, currently have, or soon will have a body in the front of the classroom who is not a licensed teacher taking on the role of the teacher. So what should we do about these narratives? How do we counter them? For one, despite the systematic push by our government to undermine our public schools, most of our students continue to do well on those standardized tests, flawed as they are, and most of our schools are certified, even though the tests are flawed. And most of our students transition fine to college, to trade schools, and to careers. And perhaps more importantly, in schools that are well-funded, and by the way, Arlington County, Virginia funds each student at over 3 times what Chesterfield funds each student, okay? In schools that are well-funded, those students actually compete on the international level with Finland and Singapore, which validates the idea that money absolutely is necessary to improve our schools and gives the lie to all the people who say that throwing money at schools won't do one doggone thing. Well, the evidence says, yes, it will.
So in maybe about 20 minutes, we're going to open up for audience.
Okay, because it was one statement that was made that is a mischaracterization of what actually happened in Nashville, and I just wanted to clarify that statement.
Okay, I mean, this is things that people disagree on, and we want your perspective in the room. So just in about 20 minutes, we'll start our Q&A. Yeah, for sure. So I think that it's funny you say that. I talked to a teacher one time who said, they keep saying you can't throw money at the problem, and she said, my response is, try. And so building on that, Rachel, you and I had a chance to talk yesterday about this idea that sometimes policy can drive narratives, and sometimes narratives can drive policy. And I want to ask if you can talk about the policy picture in education and how that's been helping to drive these pro-privatization initiatives, especially at the federal level, but also at the state level.
Okay, great. First of all, I just want to say Happy New Year to all of my Jewish people here. I'm just going to give a super brief history of American public education. When white Europeans colonized what became the United States, schools, if they existed, were local endeavors, and they were for white children only, usually wealthy white males. And then after the Civil War, the states started to take on a greater role, and this was state level centralization, if you will. And then in 1965, with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under Johnson, the federal government took on a much greater role. And there were 6 basic roles that the feds played: collection of data and statistics about education and reporting of that to the American people, promoting, supporting, and enforcing equality of educational opportunity, spending to support equity for disadvantaged students, protecting the civil rights of minority groups, funding mandates requiring schools to educate students with disabilities, and administering programs to provide financial aid for higher education. And those were all great things, and ESEA was monumental, but there were several limitations of ESEA. Eventually, ESEA focused on compensatory money funding, not desegregation. And even though there were all these desegregation orders, they didn't have teeth. And so they were hard to follow, they weren't really followed up upon later. And also, ESEA eventually became our chief anti-poverty program instead of social programs. And the idea was that rather than protect people from the whims of the market, the idea was we would prepare students and people to compete in the market. And the onus for dealing with risk was placed on families and on the individual. And the idea that poverty was caused by culture and not conditions gained prevalence. In the meantime, there were tax cuts to stimulate economic growth and educational initiatives and job training. And none of this disturbed white middle class people because they weren't asked for any kind of redistribution of wealth or income. And then eventually we shifted to this accountability model that we learned about in the movie we just saw. And this was a win because it was popular both with conservatives and with civil rights groups, and then also with suburban whites and neoliberals and centrists. And there was a focus on outputs rather than inputs, meaning the outputs being test scores rather than inputs being money and opportunity. And there was a restructuring of public education systems around principles of choice, competition, flexibility, rather than more collective remedies intended to address race and class-based disparities. And then the movie really covered NCLV and the Obama-Duncan administration policies, which were, kind of more of the same, same with Reagan and Bush before them. And I want to say that Race to the Top was, in a sinister way, was brilliant, because Race to the Top got states to spend all this money to make reforms that the feds wanted, and then maybe the feds would give them a little money if they won. And so then again, the onus was put on the states and on the taxpayers to make those changes. And their policies were focused on standards and assessments, school restructuring, teacher quality and evaluation. Again, the movie did a great job of covering all of those things. I'll say, in terms of education policy in Virginia, and again, I'm going to give a really quick overview. Virginia has a shameful history of enslavement of people of African descent, Jim Crow policies, segregation, massive resistance, discrimination. We still see remnants of all of those today. But public education as an institution is supported, at least nominally, though not with money necessarily, but we do have backdoor vouchers. The McDonnell administration really tried hard to initiate education reform policies that we've talked about. And charter school laws vary by state. And so in Virginia, the laws that we have say that charter schools must stay under public democratic control of the local education organization or the school board. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think, and Rachel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think in part, Virginia has laws that protect more against charterization because, as we know, when there was an effort to integrate in Virginia, there was a huge backlash. And part of the way the civil rights movement in Virginia defeated that backlash was passing laws that made it harder to use public money for private schools. And that's part, is that part of what?
So yeah, just quickly, basically there's a lot more backlash against charters because it's so reminiscent of the segregation academies from the era of massive resistance. So that's still there like an open sore. And I would say that there are local school districts who want charter schools, but they want to control them. They don't want the state to control them, which is what McDonnell wanted to do. He wanted to set up one of these state institutions, state boards that takes over the bottom, 5% of failing schools and put them under state control. Well, some of these local school districts said, no, we want to set up charters, but we want them accountable to our school boards and not to, we don't want to have our school board and our members of our public disenfranchised. So I always tell people, it's not just about charter schools or not charter schools, it's about the policies and laws that govern them. Because you can call something a magnet school, you can call it what you want, the governance matters. And I will say also that some of these policy, like support for public education doesn't always line up neatly between Republicans and Democrats, because rural Republicans do not want charter schools, they do not want vouchers because they're just not financially sustainable. They can't happen there. So just keep that in mind also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing for us to keep in mind, right, is every parent has a responsibility and is trying to figure out the best way to pursue education for their kid, right? But part of what we understand when we watch a film like this is that charters and charterization really used as a Trojan horse to advance a kind of an agenda that corporate interests have in our area. So I think I appreciate Rachel taking us into some of the kind of policy history. And Chris, in your work, you focus a lot on the Virginia State Legislature, and I want to ask, what are the things that you're seeing move through our state legislature that are of concern to you? What's the kind of political landscape of the state legislature that we should be thinking about if we want to be fighting to defend public education?
Thank you, Gary. So that was my first time seeing the film, and I was just struck by the parallels of what has been going on in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and what's been going on in Virginia and Richmond. They mentioned the $1 billion funding reduction post-recession. Well, we also had a $1 billion funding reduction post-recession. They talked about Philadelphia seeing the largest share of those funding cuts. Virginia, the school divisions with the highest child poverty rates were cut by 3 times as much per student as the divisions with the lowest child poverty rates. They talk about all of the staffing challenges with custodial staff, nurses, counselors. Since the recession and those funding cuts hit, Virginia has had 55,000 more students come into the schools, but we've actually cut staffing. Support staff positions have declined by more than 2,000. So all of this is happening, and at the same time, we're also seeing privatization legislation getting introduced every single legislative session. So the same financial, the state undermining the ability of public education to provide the services that teachers and other staff want to provide. There's also efforts to siphon away public funding through other methods. And so charter schools, as we're kind of discussed here, have not been at kind of the forefront of some of the more aggressive efforts of privatization. But I will touch on that briefly, but vouchers certainly are. Every year since 2015, there's been a bill to create vouchers here in Virginia. They are not called vouchers, they're called parental choice educational savings accounts. But they provide payments to families for a variety of educational services, including tuition at private schools. It can also cover costs of homeschooling, transportation, internet access, among other things. And these bills have actually made it all the way to the governor's desk 2 years, in 16 and 17. And if it wasn't, and so a signature by the governor away from becoming law here in the state of Virginia. Governor McCullough vetoed both of those efforts. But they're definitely a very real possibility, and we will continue to see these introduced going forward. In addition to that, these aren't just any type of vouchers or ESA bills that are being put forward. They're on par with some of what I would characterize as the most harmful or poorly constructed very similar to what Nevada passed, and their state courts ruled unconstitutional, and eventually their legislature struck. But that's because it has, in the bills, when they're first introduced, oftentimes have no eligibility requirements, meaning that there's no income limitations for participating families. So if a millionaire wants to send their child to private school, they can get a subsidy from the state to do so. It's also not limited to certain student groups like other states do, like just special education or just schools that are not meeting accreditation status. In addition to that, the payments themselves are way below the actual private school tuition costs. They range in size depending on where you live, but on average about $4,500 per student, where average tuition prices for elementary school are about $10,000 per student in Virginia, and in high school about $15,000. So what that means is it's really just subsidized segregation, because low-income families are not going to be able to participate, and they're going to have to find other funding sources if they're going to be able to actually utilize these vouchers. So instead, this is a payment going to middle and upper income families to send their kids to private school. So that is something that is a threat but does not exist. But as was mentioned, backdoor or neo vouchers do exist in Virginia, and these are scholarship tax credits. And the way they function is they create a tax incentive for wealthy individuals or corporations to make donations to a nonprofit to provide tuition coverage for individual students. And while that doesn't sound necessarily like a bad thing, the tax incentive is so large that it can actually profit the individual or the corporations making those donations. In some other states, the size of the credit is 100% of their donation. So for every dollar that they donate, they can take $1 off their tax liability. So it's a dollar for dollar. In Virginia, it's 65% of the credit. So a large portion of the credit they can claim. And we have this in existence. There's been bills to expand the generosity of the credit. Just this past legislative session, eligibility for the participating was passed by the General Assembly and signed by Governor Northam to expand eligibility for pre-K slots. So this is an active area, and Carrie, you haven't done a sign yet, have you? Okay, I'm still good. All right, I'm on a roll here. I'm afraid I'm just like flying by my time limit. And so to watch the presentation here, these are all very real threats that are happening here every year, and they're not necessarily getting the press coverage. They're happening at 7 a.m. in a subcommittee in the General Assembly building that maybe got moved to that committee the day before with no notice, and it's just a few actors like the Virginia Education Association and a few other groups that find out about it that could be there to speak about why this is a bad idea and the harms that it can cause to the revenues in the state. And so with that, I'm really excited that there's people here talking about these issues and raising awareness that they exist.